There is a specific kind of heartbreak that only comes from the people who share your blood. It does not announce itself with a loud crash or a sudden explosion. Instead, it creeps in quietly, dressed up as love, disguised as obligation, and wrapped in the suffocating velvet of family duty. For most women, the instinct to protect and provide for their family is woven into their very DNA. We are taught to be the glue, the peacemakers, the ones who sacrifice our own comfort to ensure the table is set and everyone else is fed. But what happens when the people sitting at that table look at your sacrifice not as a gift, but as an entitlement? What happens when the family you bled to build decides they no longer need the architect, but they absolutely want to keep the house? This is a story about the breaking point. It is about a woman who spent her entire life carrying the weight of an empire on her shoulders, only to be told she was no longer worthy of standing in its halls. But more importantly, this is a story about what happens when you push the wrong woman too far. The rain lashed heavily against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Mitchell Pinnacle Executive Suite, distorting the glittering skyline of the city into a blur of neon and gray. Inside, the room was a sanctuary of quiet, calculated power. At the center of it all sat Claire Mitchell. At 32 years old, Claire did not look like the stereotypical ruthless corporate raider, but her mind was sharper than any blade in the boardroom. She rubbed her tired eyes, the soft glow of the monitor illuminating the dark circles beneath them. On the polished mahogany desk in front of her lay a stack of contracts, the Redwood acquisition. It was a multi-million-dollar real estate deal that had taken her 8 grueling months to negotiate, fighting tooth and nail against rival firms and skeptical investors. It was the crowning achievement of her career, a deal that would secure Mitchell Pinnacle's dominance for the next decade. Claire picked up her pen and signed her name on the final page. Her signature was elegant, deliberate, and firm. As she capped the pen, a heavy sigh escaped her lips. She was exhausted. Not just the kind of exhaustion that comes from a long week, but a deep, bone-weary fatigue that had been accumulating for years. To the outside world, Mitchell Pinnacle was a family legacy, a towering testament to the brilliance of her father, Richard Mitchell. The financial magazines loved to feature Richard on their covers, praising his visionary leadership. But those inside the glass walls of the company knew the truth. Richard was the face, the charismatic figurehead who loved cutting ribbons and playing golf with politicians. Claire was the spine. Since she was 24, she had been the one poring over spreadsheets at 2 a.m, the one firing incompetent managers her father had hired out of pity, the one navigating the company out of the near bankruptcy her father's reckless spending had caused 7 years ago. She had saved them. She had built this empire into what it was today, and she had done it all while carrying the heavy, invisible burden of being the reliable daughter. The silence of the office was broken by the sharp, demanding trill of her personal cell phone. Claire glanced at the screen. "Mother," she hesitated. A familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Conversations with Eleanor Mitchell were rarely simple. They were intricate dances over minefields, where every word had a hidden meaning and every compliment carried a condition. Claire cleared her throat, adjusting her posture even though she was alone in the room, a reflex ingrained in her since childhood. She tapped the screen to answer. "Hello, Mother." "Claire, darling." Eleanor's voice fluttered through the speaker, as sweet and bright as a summer morning. It was a tone that always put Claire on high alert. "Are you still at the office? It's past 8 o'clock on a Friday. You work entirely too much, sweetheart. You're going to give yourself premature wrinkles." "I just finished the Redwood contracts, Mom." "It's done," Claire said, a hint of pride slipping into her voice, hoping just for a moment for a word of genuine acknowledgement. "Oh, that's wonderful news, dear. Your father will be so pleased. He was just saying to his golf buddies how stressful this quarter has been for him," Eleanor replied smoothly, seamlessly pivoting the achievement back to Richard. Claire closed her eyes, swallowing the bitter taste of disappointment. She should be used to it by now. "Anyway, darling," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping into a register of intimate excitement, "I need you to come home tonight, to the main house. We are having a special family dinner, just the 4 of us." "Tonight? Mom, I'm exhausted. I haven't slept more than 4 hours a night all week. Can we do this on Sunday?" "Absolutely not," Eleanor said, the sweetness hardening into steel for a fraction of a second before softening again. "This cannot wait. We have some wonderful family news to celebrate, and we simply cannot do it without our hardworking Claire. Your sister is already here, and we've asked the chef to prepare your favorite roasted lamb. Please, darling. For me?" There it was, the gentle, velvet-wrapped guilt trip. The implication that saying no would make Claire the difficult one, the one ruining the family's happiness. For 32 years, Claire had been molded by that exact tone. "All right," Claire breathed out, rubbing her temples. "I'll pack up now. I can be there in 40 minutes. "Perfect. Drive safe, sweetheart. We are all so eager to see you." The line clicked dead. Claire stared at the phone for a long moment. Family news. The phrase echoed in the quiet office. Usually, family news involving her older sister Vanessa meant one of two things. Vanessa had maxed out another black card and needed Claire to discreetly cover it before Richard found out, or Vanessa had grown bored of her latest vanity project. A boutique, a charity gala, a sudden interest in interior design, and needed Claire to clean up the financial mess. Claire packed her laptop into her leather briefcase, her movements methodical. She took one last look at the signed redwood contracts, feeling a surge of protective ownership, before turning off the lights and walking to the elevator. The drive to the Mitchell estate in the affluent suburbs was a journey through the physical manifestation of Claire's labor. The winding, tree-lined roads were paved with the wealth she had secured. The massive wrought-iron gates that swung open to reveal the sprawling, multi-million-dollar mansion were paid for by her late nights, her missed holidays, and her non-existent personal life. As she pulled her modest, reliable sedan into the circular driveway, it looked glaringly out of place parked next to Richard's vintage Aston Martin and Vanessa's bright red custom-ordered Porsche. Claire took a deep breath, steeling herself. She smoothed the non-existent wrinkles from her tailored gray suit, put on her armor of stoic composure, and walked through the heavy oak front doors. The house smelled of expensive lilies, wood smoke from the grand fireplace, and rosemary. The foyer was unnaturally quiet, save for the clinking of crystal coming from the formal dining room. As Claire stepped into the dining room, the scene before her looked like a carefully staged photograph for a lifestyle magazine. The long mahogany table was set with the finest china and heavy silver. At the head of the table sat Richard, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than a normal family's monthly mortgage. To his right sat Eleanor, draped in silk and dripping with understated diamonds, her smile fixed and radiant. And then there was Vanessa. At 35, Vanessa was the undisputed golden child of the Mitchell family. She possessed the kind of effortless, vibrant beauty that drew eyes the moment she entered a room. While Claire was sharp angles, neutral colors, and quiet intensity, Vanessa was bright colors, loud laughter, and constant motion. She was currently swirling a glass of deep red wine, her manicured nails tapping against the crystal. "Look who finally decided to join the land of the living," Vanessa drawled, her tone playful but carrying that familiar edge of condescension. "Honestly, Claire, you look like a ghost. Do you even know what the sun looks like anymore?" "Hello, Vanessa," Claire said evenly, taking her seat across from her sister. "The redwood deal required my full attention, which it got. It's closed." Richard's eyes lit up, but he didn't look at Claire. He looked at Eleanor. "Brilliant. That will send the stock price up at least 8% by Monday morning. The board will be thrilled." "We are so proud of the company's success," Eleanor said smoothly, reaching out to pat Richard's hand. "But let's not talk about work just yet. Let's enjoy our dinner. Chef Marcel outdid himself." The meal proceeded with the agonizing slowness of a theatrical performance where everyone knows their lines except one person. Claire ate her lamb mechanically, listening as Vanessa dominated the conversation. Vanessa talked about her upcoming trip to Milan, complaining about the difficulty of finding the right personal shopper. She talked about the stressful renovation of her penthouse. She talked about everything and nothing, all while Richard and Eleanor listened with rapt, indulgent attention. Claire watched them. This was the dynamic she had known her entire life. Vanessa was the flower meant to be admired. Claire was the soil meant to sustain her. Growing up, if Vanessa broke a vase, Claire was the one who cleaned it up to keep their father from shouting. When Vanessa dropped out of her prestigious university because it was stifling her creativity, Claire was the one who worked double shifts at her internship to prove the Mitchell name still had value. She had accepted this role because she loved them, because family was supposed to be unconditional, because she believed foolishly that her hard work would eventually earn her a place of equal respect at this table. As the plates were cleared and the heavy crystal decanter of port wine was brought out, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The playful banter died down. The air grew thick, heavy with an unspoken agenda. Richard cleared his throat, a sound that commanded absolute silence. He adjusted his posture, transforming from a jovial father into the chairman of the board. "Claire," Richard began, his voice taking on that deep, resonant timbre he used during press conferences. "We asked you here tonight because your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the future of this family, and the future of Mitchell Pinnacle." Claire set her napkin down on the table, her spine straightening instinctively. "The future is secure, Dad. With Redwood under our belt, our market share is untouchable." Yes, the numbers are fine." Richard waved a hand dismissively, as if millions of dollars of profit were a minor detail. "But a company is more than just numbers, Claire. It is a legacy. It is about image, relationships, and leadership." Claire felt a cold prickle of unease start at the base of her neck. "I don't understand." Eleanor leaned forward, her face a mask of deep maternal concern. "Darling, what your father is trying to say is that we are worried about you. You have given so much of your youth to this company. You are 32, Claire. You have no husband, no children, no life outside of that glass office. It breaks a mother's heart to see her daughter so consumed." Claire stared at her mother, completely bewildered. "Mom, I love my job. I built that company back from the ground up. I don't need—" "Let me finish," Richard interrupted, his tone hardening just a fraction. "We appreciate your hard work, Claire. We truly do. You are an excellent manager, a fantastic operations person. But Mitchell Pinnacle is entering a new era. We need a visionary at the helm, someone who understands high society, someone who can mingle with the elite, host the galas, and project the vibrant, dynamic image that our new investors are looking for." Vanessa sat up a little straighter, a small, barely contained smile playing on her lips. The realization hit Claire with the force of a physical blow. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. She looked from her father to her mother, and finally to her sister. "No," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can't be serious." "It makes perfect sense, Claire," Vanessa chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I have the connections. I'm on the board of 3 major charities. The investors love me. I can be the face of the company. And you? Well, you can finally take it a break. Maybe find a hobby. Take a cooking class." "You don't know the first thing about real estate acquisitions," Claire said, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and rising fury. She looked directly at her father. "Dad, she can't read a P&L statement. She doesn't know the difference between gross margin and operating revenue. If you put her in charge, the board will revolt. The shareholders will panic." "John, the board will do as I say," Richard snapped, his ego flaring at the challenge. "I am still the chairman. Your mother and I hold 60% of the voting shares. We have already made our decision." He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He slid it across the polished mahogany table. It stopped inches from Claire's hands. "What is this?" Claire asked, though her gut already knew the answer. "It's a formal resolution from the majority shareholders," Richard said coldly. "Effective immediately, Vanessa is appointed as Chief Executive Officer of Mitchell Pinnacle. You are being relieved of your duties as Chief Operating Officer." The words hung in the air, heavy and violent. Relieved of your duties. Fired. They were firing her from the company she had bled for, the company she had saved from his incompetence, to hand it over to a woman who treated corporate finance like a personal shopping spree. "You're firing me," Claire stated, her voice eerily calm as the shock began to calcify into something much harder. "We are giving you a severance package, darling," Eleanor said quickly, her voice taking on that urgent, pleading tone she used to manipulate situations. "A very generous one. 6 months of your salary. You can travel. Go to Europe. Find yourself. Claire, please understand, Vanessa needs this." Claire turned her gaze slowly to her mother. "Vanessa needs this?" "Yes," Eleanor said, reaching across the table to try and grab Claire's hand, but Claire pulled away. Eleanor's eyes filled with practiced, strategic tears. "Your sister has been struggling, Claire. Her marriage is on the rocks. Her husband's family looks down on her because she doesn't have a real career. She feels lost. You are so strong, Claire. You have always been the strong one. You can survive anything. You can start over anywhere. But Vanessa is fragile. If she doesn't have a foundation, she will break. As a family, We have to protect the weakest link. The sheer audacity of the manipulation left Claire breathless. You are strong, so you must be punished. She is weak, so she must be rewarded with the fruits of your labor. It was the ultimate betrayal. Her mother was not just stealing her life's work. She was weaponizing Claire's own competence against her. She was demanding that Claire set herself on fire to keep Vanessa warm, simply because Claire was better at burning. So my reward for saving this family from bankruptcy, Claire said, her voice dropping an octave, cold and precise, is to be discarded so Vanessa can play CEO. Don't be dramatic, Claire, Vanessa scoffed, rolling her eyes. You're acting like we're throwing you out on the street. You're getting a severance. And honestly, you should be thanking us. You're a workaholic. It's pathetic. We're doing you a favor. I built this company, Claire said to Richard, ignoring her sister. The Redwood deal, the Sterling merger, the international expansion, that was all me. You sat on the golf course while I stayed up for 3 days straight fighting off hostile takeovers. Without me, there is no Mitchell Pinnacle. Richard's face darkened, his jaw clenching. His vanity, his most sensitive trigger, had been hit. He stood up, slamming his hand on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. How dare you! Richard roared, the mask of the benevolent patriarch completely gone. I gave you your start. You work under my name. Everything you have is because I allowed you to have it. You are an employee of this family, Claire, and nothing more. I will not have my own daughter sit at my table and disrespect me. I am the only reason this table still belongs to you, Claire shot back, standing up to face him. Enough! Eleanor cried out, pressing a hand to her chest as if she might faint. Stop it, both of you. Claire, look what you are doing. You are tearing this family apart with your selfishness. Why must you always make everything so difficult? Why can't you just support your sister for once in your life? Selfishness. The word echoed in Claire's mind. She looked at her mother's weeping face, her father's furious glare, and her sister's smug, triumphant smile. In that singular moment, the veil dropped completely. 32 years of illusion shattered on the dining room floor. They did not love her. Not really. They loved what she could do for them. They loved her utility. She was not a daughter. She was a workhorse, an asset to be utilized and discarded when a shinier, more favorable option presented itself. The velvet wrapping had fallen away, revealing the cold, jagged blade beneath. I need your company laptop, your phone, and your building access card, Richard demanded, his voice devoid of any familial warmth. Security has already been notified. Your personal items will be boxed up and sent to your apartment on Monday. Claire looked at the man who had taught her how to ride a bicycle, the man whose approval she had spent a lifetime chasing. He was looking at her not as a father looks at a child, but as a CEO looks at a terminated employee who poses a security risk. You're doing this right now? Claire asked, the final remnants of her disbelief fading away. In the middle of the night? Company policy, Richard said coldly. Hand them over, Claire. Claire didn't scream. She didn't cry. The time for begging for their love was over. Moving with slow, deliberate precision, she unclasped her briefcase. She took out the sleek silver laptop, the company cell phone, and the heavy plastic key card. She placed them quietly on the table, right next to her half-eaten plate of lamb. Take them, Claire said. Thank you, Richard said, refusing to meet her eyes. Now please leave. You are upsetting your mother. Claire turned and walked out of the dining room. She didn't look back. She walked through the grand foyer, her heels clicking against the marble floor, the sound echoing in the massive, empty space. As she reached the front door, 2 men in dark suits stepped out of the shadows. It was Marcus and David, the head of the estate's private security, men whose salaries Claire personally approved every month. I'm sorry, Miss Mitchell, Marcus said, his voice tight with discomfort. Mr. Mitchell's orders. We have to escort you off the property. I know the way. Marcus, Claire said quietly. She opened the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the night. The storm had worsened. The rain was coming down in sheets, cold and unforgiving. She didn't have an umbrella. She didn't care. She walked down the wide stone steps, the freezing rain instantly soaking through her expensive wool suit, plastering her hair to her face. The security guards walked 2 paces behind her, a silent, humiliating procession. They watched as she unlocked her sedan, opened the door, and slipped inside. The door slammed shut, cutting off the sound of the rain. The interior of the car was dark and cold. Claire sat in the driver's seat. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. Her clothes were ruined, her career had just been stolen, and her family had thrown her out like garbage into the storm. By all normal human standards, this was the moment a person should break down. This was the moment for uncontrollable sobbing, for screaming into the steering wheel, for the crushing weight of betrayal to shatter her spirit. Claire looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Water dripped from her chin. Her mascara had smudged slightly under her eyes. Slowly, deliberately, the corners of Claire's mouth twitched. Then they curved upwards into a sharp, terrifying smile. There were no tears in her eyes, only a cold, brilliant, calculating light. She reached beneath the driver's seat, her fingers feeling along the metal tracks until they brushed against a small black object attached by a magnet. She pulled it out. It was a cheap prepaid burner phone. She turned it on. The screen bathed her face in a pale blue glow in the darkness of the car. She opened the messaging app, navigated to a single, unsaved number, and typed a message with swift, steady fingers. Phase 1 initiated. They took the bait. Let them have the wheel. She hit send. Claire Mitchell leaned back against the headrest, listening to the rain hammer against the roof of her car. Her father thought he had just executed a masterful corporate coup. Her mother thought she had successfully manipulated the family dynamic to protect her golden child. Her sister thought she had finally won the throne she never worked for. They thought they had broken the scapegoat. They had no idea that they hadn't fired Claire. They had simply unlocked her cage. And the woman who had spent a decade keeping the Mitchell empire from burning to the ground was about to show them exactly how easily she could strike the match. 3 months is exactly enough time to build a new habit, but as Claire Mitchell watched from a distance, she learned it was also exactly enough time to burn a family legacy to the ground. For the first time since she was 22 years old, Claire's mornings did not begin with a barrage of urgent emails, frantic phone calls from panicked department heads, or the suffocating weight of keeping Mitchell Pinnacle afloat. Instead, she woke up to the quiet hum of a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city. There were no vaulted ceilings, no panoramic views of the skyline, and no live-in housekeeper to press her suits. She stood in her small kitchen, dressed in comfortable cashmere sweatpants and a loose sweater, holding a mug of black coffee. She leaned against the laminate counter and watched the morning news on a small television perched next to the microwave. The screen flashed with a segment from a prominent financial network. The banner at the bottom read, "Mitchell Pinnacle, a new era of glamour, but at what cost?" The camera cut to a glittering red carpet event held the previous night. There, standing in front of a wall of white roses bearing the company logo, was Vanessa. She wore a custom-designed emerald silk gown that Claire immediately recognized as a $50,000 piece from a Milan runway. Vanessa was laughing, tossing her perfectly styled hair, and holding a flute of vintage champagne while a reporter thrust a microphone toward her. "Vanessa, your first quarter as CEO has certainly made waves," the reporter gushed. "The rebranding gala tonight is spectacular. What is your vision for the company moving forward?" Vanessa offered a dazzling, practiced smile. "Well, Tom, I believe real estate isn't just about buildings and contracts. It's about lifestyle. It's about curating an experience. Mitchell Pinnacle has been so dusty and traditional for too long. I'm bringing passion back to the boardroom. We are focusing on synergy, luxury, and aesthetics." Claire took a slow sip of her coffee, her expression unreadable. Synergy, luxury, aesthetics, buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing on a balance sheet. "And what about the rumors of the Redwood acquisition stalling?" the reporter pressed, the tone shifting slightly. Vanessa's smile tightened for a fraction of a second, her eyes flashing with brief annoyance before the polished mask slipped back into place. "Oh, you know how these old-school developers are. They get nervous around bold female leadership. We are simply restructuring the terms to better align with my new creative vision for the portfolio. Everything is perfectly under control." Claire reached over and turned off the television. The screen went black, cutting off her sister's radiant, lying face. Everything was not under control. It was, in fact, an unmitigated disaster. Claire walked over to the small wooden dining table that now served as her command center. It was covered in neat stacks of printed spreadsheets, financial projections, and a sleek, heavily encrypted laptop. She sat down, her fingers flying across the keyboard to unlock the secure portal she had established weeks ago. She didn't need to watch the news to know what was happening inside Mitchell Pinnacle. She had a front-row seat to the carnage. When Claire had been summarily discarded that rainy night, she had left her company laptop and phone on the dining room table. What Richard and Eleanor didn't know, what they could never comprehend, was that loyalty in the corporate world is rarely given to a name on a building. It is given to the person in the trenches. Claire had spent a decade building relationships with the people who actually kept the lights on. The senior accountants, the lead legal counsels, the IT directors, they all knew who really signed their paychecks. When Vanessa took over, the culture shifted overnight from a meritocracy to a dictatorship of vanity, and the competent people, the ones Claire had mentored and protected, were furious. They became her eyes and ears. Every Tuesday and Friday, encrypted files were quietly dropped into a secure server Claire had set up. She opened the latest batch of files, her eyes scanning the numbers with the practiced ease of a surgeon reading an X-ray. The hemorrhage of cash was staggering. Vanessa had immediately diverted millions of dollars from the operating budget to fund what she called the Pinnacle Renaissance. She had hired a celebrity interior designer to completely gut and remodel the executive suites, turning Claire's former functional office into an ostentatious lounge of white marble, velvet couches, and modern art installations. She had replaced the company's fleet of standard sedans with luxury SUVs for upper management. She threw lavish, incredibly expensive parties under the guise of networking events, where no actual business was ever discussed. But the vanity spending was only a symptom of the fatal disease. The real tragedy was Vanessa's absolute incompetence at the negotiation table. Claire opened a memo regarding the Redwood acquisition, the deal Claire had finalized the very night she was fired. According to the internal emails, the lead partner of the Redwood Group, a traditional no-nonsense businessman named Arthur Sterling, had flown in to formally welcome the new CEO. Vanessa had arrived 45 minutes late to the meeting, spent the entire time texting on her phone, and then condescendingly suggested that Sterling's architectural plans lacked feminine intuition. Sterling had walked out. The deal was officially dead. The 8% stock bump Richard had bragged about was gone, replaced by a devastating 14% plunge when the market realized Mitchell Pinnacle had lost its biggest anchor project of the decade. Claire leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The anger that had burned so hotly in her chest 3 months ago had cooled into something much more dangerous. Absolute crystalline clarity. She opened a folder labeled Family Communications. Her inside sources occasionally forwarded her emails between Richard, Eleanor, and Vanessa. Reading them was like watching passengers argue over the dinner menu while the Titanic took on water. Richard was in deep denial. He was using his personal fortune and leveraging his own shares to quietly inject cash into the company's accounts to hide the massive quarterly losses from the broader board of directors. He was desperately trying to keep the illusion alive that his decision to appoint Vanessa was a stroke of genius. Eleanor, ever the master of gaslighting, was busy managing the social fallout. She sent emails to their high society friends, spinning the company's financial hiccups as growing pains, and praising Vanessa's bravery in modernizing a dinosaur of a company. Whenever a board member raised a red flag, Eleanor would invite their wives to lunch, showering them with gifts and flattery to buy their husband's silence. They were bleeding out, and instead of applying a tourniquet, they were buying more expensive bandages. Claire closed the laptop and walked to the window, looking down at the quiet street below. She felt a strange, hollow sensation in her chest. She had thought, perhaps in some naive corner of her heart, that after a month or two of failure, her father would call. She thought he would swallow his pride, admit Vanessa was driving them off a cliff, and ask Claire to come back and fix it. She had prepared herself for that call, wondering how she would negotiate her return. But the call never came. Instead, they doubled down. They chose the illusion of the golden child over the reality of their own survival. They would rather drive the family legacy into bankruptcy than admit that the daughter they treated like a workhorse was the only one capable of steering the ship. Fine, Claire thought, her jaw setting into a hard line. If you want to drive, I will let you hit the wall. The real shift, the moment that pushed the game past the point of no return, happened 2 weeks later. It was a gloomy Tuesday afternoon. Claire was at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of chamomile tea, waiting for the bi-weekly data drop. When the notification pinged, she opened the secure folder. There were the usual grim updates. 3 more mid-level managers had resigned, the marketing budget was overdrawn by 200%, and a major supplier was threatening a lawsuit over unpaid invoices. But there was another file, a heavily encrypted PDF marked with a high-priority red flag from her source in the legal department. The note attached to it simply read, "Claire, you need to see this immediately. I think they've lost their minds." Frowning, Claire entered the decryption keys. The document opened on her screen. It was a loan agreement, a massive, complex offshore debt instrument. Claire's eyes darted across the text, absorbing the dense financial jargon. Her blood began to run cold. Mitchell Pinnacle was taking on a $50 million loan from a shadow banking syndicate based out of the Cayman Islands. It was a desperation move, a last resort cash injection designed to keep a dying company breathing just a little bit longer. But it wasn't the amount that made Claire's breath catch in her throat. It was the terms. The interest rates were predatory, bordering on extortion. There were clauses hidden in the fine print that tied the company's remaining hard assets, including the very building they operated out of, as direct collateral. If they missed a single payment, the syndicate could seize the entire portfolio within 30 days. No legitimate bank in the United States would have touched Mitchell Pinnacle with its current balance sheet, which meant Vanessa had gone to the dark corners of the financial world to get cash to keep her vanity project alive. It was corporate suicide. But Vanessa wasn't just foolish. She was cowardly. And that cowardice was about to reveal the true depths of the family's depravity. Claire scrolled rapidly to the final page of the document, where the authorization signatures were required. There were 3 lines. The first line bore Richard Mitchell's signature, authorizing the use of company assets as collateral. The second line was blank, where the CFO should have signed. The third line was the guarantor, the person who was legally taking on the personal liability if the company defaulted, the person who the federal authorities would come looking for when this highly illegal, unregulated offshore transaction inevitably collapsed. Claire stared at the screen, her heart hammering a slow, painful rhythm against her ribs. The signature on the guarantor line was elegant, deliberate, and firm. It was her name, Claire Elizabeth Mitchell. She leaned closer to the screen, tracing the curves of the ink with her eyes. It was a masterful forgery. If she hadn't known with absolute certainty that she had been sitting in her apartment for 3 months, she might have believed she had signed it herself. The air in the apartment suddenly felt freezing. Claire pushed her chair back and stood up, her hands trembling. Not from fear, but from a rage so profound, so absolute, it felt like it might tear her apart from the inside out. Vanessa had found out the company was completely out of cash. She had panicked. She knew that if the board found out she had bankrupted the empire in a single financial quarter, she would be ruined. Her social standing, her luxury, her entire identity would vanish. So she had arranged this illegal loan to cover her tracks. But Vanessa, for all her ignorance, understood one basic rule of business. If you play with illegal money, someone eventually goes to prison. She wasn't going to let it be her. And Richard and Eleanor, who had to have known about this, who had to have watched Vanessa trace Claire's signature onto that document, had allowed it. They weren't just throwing her under the bus anymore. They were tying her to the tracks. Claire began to pace the small living room, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. She imagined the conversation that must have taken place in the mahogany dining room. She could hear Eleanor's soothing, poisonous voice. Claire is strong. Her name is still on the old banking mandates. If the authorities ask, we'll just say it was a deal she arranged before she left. She's smart. She'll figure a way out of it. We have to protect Vanessa. We have to protect the family. They were willing to send her to a federal penitentiary. The daughter who had saved them, the sister who had cleaned up every mess, the woman who had sacrificed her youth to build their wealth. She was nothing more than a scapegoat, a convenient sacrifice to be slaughtered on the altar of Vanessa's vanity. Any lingering trace of guilt, any small, pathetic voice inside Claire that still yearned for her family's love, died in that moment. It didn't just die, it evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating emptiness. They thought she was a victim. They thought they could forge her name, steal her freedom, and continue drinking champagne while she took the fall. Claire stopped pacing. She walked back to the laptop and stared at the forged signature. She didn't call the police. She didn't call the FBI. When you are fighting a monster that wears your mother's face, you do not hand the sword to a stranger. You wield it yourself. She picked up her burner phone and typed a message to the legal contact who had sent the file. I see it. Do not flag it in the system. Let the funds transfer. Let the ink dry. The reply came a minute later. Claire, are you crazy? It's $50 million. When this defaults, the feds will arrest you. It's your signature. Claire's fingers hovered over the keypad. A slow, chilling smile touched her lips, a smile that would have terrified Richard Mitchell had he been there to see it. She typed her response. They didn't forge my signature to a loan. They forged my signature to their own death warrant. Prepare the Arthur files. She hit send, set the phone face down on the table, and walked into the kitchen to pour the rest of her tea down the sink. The waiting period was over. It was time to go to war. The illusion of limitless wealth is a delicate, shimmering bubble. It requires constant inflation to maintain its shape. For a while, the $50 million of illegal offshore money acted as the perfect helium for Vanessa's vanity. The grand redesign of the corporate headquarters was completed, the lavish galas continued, and Richard Mitchell could still walk into his exclusive country club with his head held high. But offshore syndicates are not like traditional banks. They do not send polite letters reminding you of a missed payment. They do not care about your family name, your social standing, or your excuses. They care about one thing, the return on their investment. And when that return does not arrive on time, they do not hesitate to tighten the noose. It took exactly 45 days for the bubble to burst. The first sign of the collapse was a freezing of Mitchell Pinnacle's domestic operating accounts. The syndicate, exercising the predatory clauses hidden deep within the forged contract, filed a sweeping lien against the company's physical assets. Within 48 hours, the payroll bounced. Within 72 hours, the contractors renovating Vanessa's penthouse walked off the job. And then, the federal government noticed. When tens of millions of dollars flow from the Cayman Islands into an American real estate portfolio just before a massive default, the IRS and the Securities and Exchange Commission do not simply look the other way. The inquiries started as formal letters. Then came the subpoenas. From the quiet sanctuary of her apartment, Claire watched the panic unfold through the encrypted files sent by her loyalists. She read the frantic late-night emails Richard sent to his financial advisors. She read the hysterical, borderline incoherent messages Vanessa fired off to the legal department, demanding they make it go away, as if a federal investigation was a bad review in a lifestyle magazine. They were drowning, and the water was rising fast. It was a chilly Thursday evening when the inevitable finally happened. Claire was sitting in her small living room, a worn Afghan draped over her lap, reading a novel. The soft jazz playing on her modest stereo was abruptly shattered by the sharp, demanding knock at her front door. It wasn't a polite tap. It was the heavy, entitled knock of people who believed every door should open for them instantly. Claire marked her page, set the book down, and took a slow, centering breath. She walked to the door and looked through the peephole. There, standing in the narrow, dimly lit hallway of her apartment building, were Richard and Eleanor Mitchell. They looked profoundly out of place. Richard was wearing a dark, bespoke suit, but his posture was rigid, his face drawn and pale. Eleanor was draped in a vicuña wool coat, her hands clutching a designer handbag like a shield, her eyes darting around the hallway with undisguised distaste. Claire unbolted the door and pulled it open, her expression a mask of polite indifference. Mother? Father? What a surprise. Let us in, Claire, Richard said, his voice tight. It wasn't a request. He pushed past her without waiting for an invitation, stepping into the small living room and looking around as if he had just stepped into a slum. Eleanor followed, immediately bringing a hand to her chest. Oh, Claire, darling, is this how you've been living? It's so quaint. We must get you a proper housekeeper. It smells like cheap cleaning supplies. It smells like bleach, Mother, because I clean my own floors now, Claire said smoothly, closing the door and leaning against it. To what do I owe this pleasure? You haven't called in 3 months. The pleasantries evaporated instantly. Richard turned to face her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. We have a crisis, Claire. A severe one. The company is under federal investigation. I see, Claire said, keeping her voice completely neutral. And why are you telling me? I haven't been an employee of Mitchell Pinnacle for a fiscal quarter. Eleanor let out a sharp, ragged sob. It was a masterful performance, conjured out of thin air. She collapsed onto Claire's inexpensive sofa, burying her face in her hands. It's your sister, Claire. They're trying to destroy her. They're trying to destroy our family. Who is trying to destroy Vanessa? Claire asked calmly, moving to the kitchen counter to pour a glass of water, largely to give her hands something to do other than clench into fists. "The SEC, the IRS, the banks," Richard exploded, his composure cracking. "Vanessa made a miscalculation. She secured a bridge loan to help stabilize the company's transition. A necessary evil, but the terms were aggressive. Now the lenders are playing dirty, and the federal auditors are sniffing around the paperwork." "A bridge loan from where?" Claire asked, pretending ignorance. Richard looked away, the muscles in his jaw twitching. "An offshore entity. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the authorities are focusing on the guarantor signature. They are building a case for criminal fraud." Claire took a sip of her water, watching her father squirm over the rim of the glass. "Criminal fraud carries federal prison time. If Vanessa signed as the guarantor for a fraudulent offshore loan, she is going to be indicted." Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wide, tears perfectly tracking through her expensive makeup. "She didn't sign it. That's the point, darling. Vanessa panicked. The pressure of the CEO role, the stress of the market. She wasn't thinking clearly. She needed the funds to save your father's legacy. "So she forged my signature," Claire stated. She didn't pose it as a question. She let the words hang in the air, heavy and blunt, stripping away all the elegant euphemisms her parents were trying to use. Silence descended on the small apartment. Richard wouldn't meet her eyes. Eleanor's sobbing hitched, suspended in the unbearable tension of the truth. "We didn't know until it was too late," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "Claire, you have to believe us. When your father found out, he was furious with her. But the ink is dry. The auditors have the documents. If they prove Vanessa forged your name, she will go to federal prison. Her husband will divorce her. Her life will be completely over." Claire set her glass down. She looked at the woman who had birthed her, the woman who was currently using the full force of her maternal influence to orchestrate a tragedy. "And what exactly are you asking me to do, Mother?" Claire asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. Eleanor stood up, crossing the small room, reaching out to grasp Claire's hands. Her grip was desperate, her long nails digging into Claire's skin. "We need you to claim the signature, sweetheart. We need you to tell the investigators that you signed that document, that you arranged the loan before you left the company as a final attempt to secure our future, and that you didn't tell us because you knew we wouldn't approve." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the request hit Claire like a physical blow. Even though she had known this was coming, hearing the words spoken aloud in her own home was a different kind of horror. "You want me to confess to federal financial fraud," Claire said, enunciating every single syllable. "You want me to take the fall for a $50 million offshore extortion ring." "It wouldn't be so bad for you," Eleanor pleaded, her voice rising in pitch, the desperation making her cruel. "You are so strong, Claire. You've always been a survivor. You don't have a husband. You don't have children to leave behind. A few years in a minimum security facility. It would just be a quiet retreat for you. You raid so much anyway. But Vanessa is fragile. She's a mother. A prison sentence would break her mind. It would kill her. You can't let your sister die in a cage, Claire. You can't. You don't have a family to leave behind." The words echoed in Claire's mind. It was the ultimate dismissal of her humanity. Because she had spent her life working for them instead of building a life for herself, they now viewed her life as entirely expendable. "Blood is thicker than water, Claire," Richard added, his voice low, trying to project a sense of noble sacrifice. "This family gave you everything. We raised you. We put you through the best schools. It is time to repay that debt. If you do this, I will make sure a trust is set up in your name. When you get out, you will be taken care of for the rest of your life. But you have to save your sister." Claire looked from her father's stern, demanding face to her mother's weeping, manipulative eyes. She felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. The last frayed thread that tied her to these people simply dissolved into dust. There was no more anger, no more heartbreak. Only the cold, mechanical precision of a trap snapping shut. "I see," Claire said softly, pulling her hands free from her mother's grip. She took a step back, putting distance between them. "And how exactly do we execute this?" Richard's shoulders sagged in a massive exhale of relief. He actually smiled, a brief, fleeting grimace of triumph. He thought he had won. He thought the good, obedient workhorse had accepted the yoke one final time. "Arthur is waiting downstairs in the car," Richard said quickly, regaining his authoritative CEO cadence. "I didn't want to bring him up until we had spoken as a family. He has drawn up an affidavit, a sworn legal confession. You just need to sign it, backdate it to the week before your departure, and Arthur will hand-deliver it to the SEEC investigators tomorrow morning." P.M. Arthur Sterling, the silver-haired, distinguished legal counsel for Mitchell Pinnacle. Arthur had been Richard's right-hand man for 30 years. He was the family's consigliere, the man who knew where all the bodies were buried, the man Richard trusted more than his own wife. "Bring him up," Claire said quietly. Richard immediately pulled out his phone and made the call. 2 minutes later, a heavy knock sounded at the door. Arthur stepped into the apartment. He was a tall man in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a navy pinstripe suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He had the kind, grandfatherly face of a man who could smile warmly while legally evicting an orphanage. "Claire, my dear," Arthur said, his voice rich and soothing. "It pains me to see you in these circumstances." "Let's skip the pleasantries, Arthur," Richard snapped, his patience wearing thin. "Do you have the document?" Arthur placed his briefcase on Claire's small dining table. The click of the brass lock sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick stack of legal paper, heavily bound, with red tabs indicating where signatures were required. He laid a gold Mont Blanc pen gently on top of the pages. "This is a sworn affidavit," Arthur explained, looking at Claire with solemn eyes. "It clearly states that you, acting independently and without the knowledge of the board or the current CEO, secured the offshore loan and guaranteed it with company assets. By signing this, you absolve your father, your mother, and Vanessa of any legal wrongdoing." Eleanor hovered nearby, her hands clasped tightly together. "Just sign it, darling. Let's put this nightmare behind us." Claire walked over to the table. She looked down at the document. She picked up the heavy gold pen, feeling its weight in her hand. She let the silence stretch, agonizing and long. She could feel Richard and Eleanor holding their breath, their entire luxurious, fraudulent existence balancing on the tip of the pen in her hand. Then Claire set the pen down. "No," Claire said. The word dropped like an anvil. Eleanor gasped. Richard stepped forward, his face flushing crimson. "What do you mean, no? We just agreed. You are signing that paper, Claire, or I swear to God—" "Or you will do what, Richard?" Claire interrupted, her voice turning to ice, discarding the title of father forever. "You will fire me again? You will kick me out of an apartment you don't own? You have no leverage here. I am not signing a confession for a crime your golden child committed." "You selfish, ungrateful bitch!" Richard roared, lunging forward, but Arthur smoothly stepped between them, raising a hand to stop the older man. "Claire," Eleanor wept, dropping to her knees on the cheap carpet. "Please, they will put Vanessa in handcuffs. They will put her in a cage." "Then perhaps she should have learned how to read a contract before she forged a signature," Claire said, looking down at her mother with absolute, terrifying indifference. "Get out of my house, both of you." "Arthur, make her sign it," Richard demanded, spit flying from his lips. "Tell her the legal consequences if she doesn't." Arthur slowly closed his leather briefcase. The metallic clicks sounded different this time. Final. He turned to Richard, his grandfatherly face entirely devoid of warmth. "The only legal consequences I am concerned with, Richard, are the ones you are currently facing," Arthur said, his voice completely steady. Richard froze. Eleanor stopped crying, looking up from the floor in confusion. "Arthur, what are you talking about?" Arthur reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He didn't pull out another document. He pulled out a small, sleek digital audio recorder. He pressed a button, and the crisp, clear audio of Richard Mitchell's voice filled the room. "I don't care how you write the affidavit, Arthur. Just make sure it explicitly states Claire acted alone. Frame her for the whole damn thing. Vanessa cannot go to prison. I'll pay you double your retainer if you make this airtight." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating terror. Richard stumbled backward, his face draining of all color, looking as if he had just been shot in the chest. "Arthur, you recorded me? Why? You've been my lawyer for 30 years. "I was your lawyer, Richard," Arthur corrected smoothly, moving to stand beside Claire. "Until 2 years ago, when you tried to secretly use my legal firm as a shell to hide your personal tax evasion. You were going to let me lose my license and go to prison to protect your own wealth." Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Arthur turned to Claire, a look of profound respect in his eyes. "If Claire hadn't discovered your little scheme and quietly warned me, my life would have been ruined. She spent 3 weeks meticulously rerouting the paper trail to protect me, saving my career and my freedom. You see, Richard, you demand loyalty through fear and money. Claire earns it through competence and protection." Eleanor scrambled to her feet, backing away toward the door, staring at Arthur and Claire as if they were monsters. "You planned this. You set us up." "I didn't forge the signature, Mother," Claire said, crossing her arms over her chest. "I didn't take out the loan. I didn't run the company into the ground. All I did was step out of the way and let you destroy yourselves. Arthur has been my legal counsel for 24 months. Every confidential board meeting, every panicked email, every illegal directive you gave him to cover up Vanessa's mess. He has documented it all." "You gave her attorney-client privileged information?" Richard gasped, his hands trembling violently. "The crime-fraud exception," Arthur stated, the words slicing through Richard's defense like a scalpel. "Attorney-client privilege is instantly voided when a client asks an attorney to assist in committing a crime, such as, for example, conspiring to frame an innocent party for federal fraud. The SEC and the FBI have already been provided with the unedited audio files of our meetings." "Candy seat." The walls of the trap had not just closed, they had locked. Richard Mitchell, the titan of real estate, the man who had treated his daughter like dirt beneath his expensive shoes, fell to his knees in the middle of Claire's cheap apartment. He buried his face in his hands, a pathetic, broken sound escaping his throat. Eleanor stood frozen against the door, her eyes wide, realizing that the golden life she had built on the back of her scapegoat was gone forever. "You can leave now," Claire said quietly, the finality in her voice colder than the winter wind outside. "The authorities will be at the estate by morning. I suggest you spend the night packing." The collapse of a narcissist's world does not happen in slow motion. It happens in a terrifying, chaotic freefall. When the sun rose the following morning, it did not bring the usual golden light to the Mitchell estate. Instead, it brought the flashing blue and red lights of federal vehicles. Claire did not go to the estate to watch the raid. She didn't need to. Arthur's junior associates were parked discreetly down the street, providing her with live updates. At exactly 7 a.m., agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked by auditors from the Securities and Exchange Commission, walked up the grand stone steps of the mansion. They did not knock politely. Within hours, the news broke on every major financial network. The headlines were ruthless. Mitchell Pinnacle raided in multi-million-dollar offshore fraud probe. CEO Vanessa Mitchell detained for questioning. From the quiet sanctuary of her apartment, Claire poured herself a fresh cup of coffee and watched the footage. The cameras caught Vanessa being escorted out of the glass doors of the corporate headquarters. The emerald silk gowns and designer handbags were gone. She looked small, disheveled, and utterly terrified as she hid her face behind a manila folder, flanked by federal agents. Claire took a sip of her coffee. The brew tasted exceptionally good today. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind, and Richard Mitchell was not a man who surrendered his power without trying to drag everyone else down with him. Claire knew the game wasn't entirely over. Richard had spent 30 years building his empire on secrets, blackmail, and leverage. He would not go quietly into the dark. 2 days later, the summons arrived. It wasn't an email or a phone call. It was a heavy, wax-sealed envelope slipped under her apartment door by a private courier. Claire opened it to find a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was Richard's, sharp, aggressive, and trembling slightly. "We meet in the old boardroom at 3 p.m. today. Just the family. Come alone. If you do not show up, I release the 2021 sterling tax files to the Department of Justice. Your move, Claire." Claire stared at the note. A slow, chilling realization washed over her, followed immediately by a profound sense of pity. He really thought he still had teeth. The 2021 sterling tax files. It was the darkest skeleton in Claire's professional closet. 5 years ago, when Claire was still desperately trying to earn her father's love and prove her worth, Richard had forced her to engineer a complex tax loophole to hide massive personal capital gains he and Eleanor had accrued. He had manipulated her, telling her the company would fold if she didn't shield the money. Because she was the COO, her digital signature had authorized the transfers. It was a blatant act of tax evasion, orchestrated by Richard, but executed on paper by Claire. For years, Richard had held it over her head like an invisible guillotine. It was his ultimate insurance policy to ensure her unquestioning loyalty. He was now threatening to trigger that guillotine, willing to expose his own crime if it meant taking Claire down with him. Claire checked her watch. It was 1 p.m. She had 2 hours. She walked to her closet, bypassing the comfortable sweatpants she had worn for the last 3 months. She reached for the back of the wardrobe, pulling out her sharpest, darkest tailored power suit. She pinned her hair back into a severe, immaculate twist. She applied a bold, blood-red lipstick. She wasn't dressing for a family meeting. She was dressing for a funeral. The old boardroom of Mitchell Pinnacle was located on the 20th floor, a relic from the company's earlier, more traditional days before Vanessa's Renaissance gut renovation. The room smelled of old leather, lemon polish, and stale desperation. When Claire pushed the heavy oak doors open, the air inside was thick enough to choke on. Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking like a ghost of the titan he used to be. His face was gray, his eyes bloodshot, and his suit hung loosely on a frame that seemed to have shrunk overnight. Eleanor sat to his right, her makeup smeared, nervously twisting a diamond ring around her finger until the skin was raw. And then there was Vanessa. She was curled in a leather chair, sobbing quietly into a crumpled tissue, looking nothing like the glamorous CEO who had posed on the red carpet just weeks ago. Her passport had been confiscated. Her bank accounts were frozen. The reality of a federal indictment was finally crushing the vanity out of her. "You came," Richard rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper. He tried to project authority, but it cracked under the weight of his fear. "You threatened to send me to prison, Richard," Claire said smoothly, walking into the room. She did not sit down. She stood at the opposite end of the long table, a solitary figure radiating absolute control. "I thought it would be rude not to RSVP." "Don't take that tone with your father," Eleanor shrieked, her voice shrill and jagged. "Look at what you've done to us. Look at your sister. You let Arthur betray us. You let the FBI humiliate us on national television." "I let you face the consequences of your own actions, Mother," Claire replied, her voice cold and flat. "Vanessa forged a signature to steal $50 million. You and Richard tried to frame me for it. My only crime was refusing to be your human shield." Vanessa lifted her head, her face blotchy and swollen. "You could have warned us, Claire. You knew Arthur was recording. You knew the audit was coming. You just sat in that miserable apartment and watched me burn." "Just like you sat at the dining room table and watched me get thrown out into the rain," Claire countered, her eyes locking onto her sister's. "You wanted the crown, Vanessa. This is how heavy it is." Richard slammed his fist on the table, a weak echo of his former intimidation tactics. "Enough. We are not here to argue about the past. We are here to negotiate." Claire tilted her head slightly, an amused, dark glint in her eyes. "Negotiate? What exactly do you think you have left to negotiate with?" Richard reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He threw it onto the polished mahogany table. It slid to a stop halfway between them. "The 2021 Sterling tax files," Richard said, a nasty, desperate sneer twisting his face. "Emails, routing numbers, off-book ledgers. All carrying your digital signature, Claire. All proving that you facilitated the evasion of $4 million in federal taxes." Claire looked at the folder, her expression entirely unbothered. She didn't flinch. She didn't pale. Richard leaned forward, misinterpreting her silence as fear. "The offshore loan might be Vanessa's problem, but this is yours. If I hand this over to the DOJ, you are looking at 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. You will lose everything you've saved. You will be a convicted felon." Eleanor nodded frantically, grasping onto this final lifeline. "We can make a deal, Claire. Your father will bury that folder forever. We will burn it right here in this room. But you have to tell the feds that Arthur acted alone. You have to tell them Arthur went rogue and fabricated those audio tapes to steal the company. With your testimony against Arthur, we can cast enough reasonable doubt to get Vanessa's charges dropped." It was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. Even now, facing total annihilation, their instinct was to manipulate, threaten, and use Claire to clean up the mess. They still viewed her as an extension of themselves, a tool to be wielded. Claire let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was a terrifying sound in the silent, heavy room. Richard's sneer faltered. "You think this is funny? You think federal prison is a joke?" "No, Richard," Claire said, taking slow, deliberate steps down the length of the table toward him. "I think you are a joke." She stopped a few feet away from the folder, looking down at it like it was a piece of trash. "You really thought I would spend 5 years walking on eggshells, knowing you held that file over my head and do absolutely nothing about it?" Claire asked, her voice dropping into a deadly, quiet register. Richard's eyes widened slightly, the first true flicker of panic breaking through his bluster. What are you talking about?" Claire reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer. She pulled out a crisp white envelope bearing the official seal of the United States Department of the Treasury. She dropped it on top of Richard's manila folder. "Open it," Claire commanded. Richard hesitated, his hands shaking as he reached for the envelope. He tore the top open and pulled out the thick parchment document inside. His eyes scanned the text. As he read, the last remaining drops of blood drained from his face. His mouth opened, but he couldn't speak. He looked like a man who had just read his own autopsy report. "What is it, Richard?" Eleanor demanded, her voice cracking with hysteria. "What does it say?" Richard dropped the paper as if it had burned his fingers. Claire smiled, a cold, sharp expression devoid of any mercy. "Allow me to translate for you, Mother. That is a formal letter of immunity from the Internal Revenue Service." Vanessa stopped crying, staring at Claire in horror. 3 years ago, when I realized this family would never view me as anything more than a disposable asset, Claire continued, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls, I took my own personal savings, $2 million, and I quietly paid the principal and the penalties for the taxes you evaded in 2021. You paid it? Richard whispered, his mind incapable of processing the magnitude of her foresight. I did, Claire nodded smoothly. And more importantly, I officially self-reported the entire scheme to the IRS under the voluntary disclosure practice. I handed over all the emails, all the routing numbers, and all the audio recordings of you, Richard, explicitly ordering me to hide the funds under threat of termination. Claire placed her hands on the table, leaning in close, forcing her father to look into her eyes. Because I self-reported, paid the restitution in full, and fully cooperated with the investigation, the Department of Justice granted me absolute, unconditional immunity from prosecution, Claire whispered. I am untouchable. Eleanor let out a sharp, breathless gasp, clutching the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. But you, Claire shifted her gaze to her parents. You are not. The DOJ didn't act on the file 3 years ago because I asked them to wait. I told them I was gathering more evidence of your corporate malfeasance. And guess what? The FBI raid yesterday gave them exactly what they needed. The 2021 tax evasion charges are being bundled with Vanessa's offshore fraud indictment. That folder isn't your leverage, Richard. It's the final nail in your coffin. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the silence of a kingdom after the castle walls have fallen. Richard Mitchell, the man who had spent his life terrorizing everyone around him, shrank back in his leather chair. He looked old. He looked pathetic. The illusion of his power had been completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a frightened, greedy old man facing the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty. You planned this, Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. From the very beginning, you planned to destroy us. I planned to survive you, Claire corrected sharply, turning to face her sister. You destroyed yourselves. You were just too arrogant to realize it until the handcuffs came out. Claire straightened her posture, buttoning her blazer with a sharp, decisive snap. She had spent 32 years seeking the validation of the people in this room. She had bled for them, cried for them, and carried their burdens until her own back broke. Looking at them now, broken, terrified, and facing the total destruction of the false reality they had built, she realized something profound. She didn't need their validation. She never had. She was the architect of the empire, and they were merely squatters who had finally been evicted. The SEC is finalizing the asset seizure as we speak, Claire said, turning her back on them and walking toward the heavy oak doors. Your personal bank accounts will be frozen by midnight. This building, this company, the cars, the estate, it all belongs to the federal government now to pay off the syndicate debt." "Claire, please!" Eleanor wailed, abandoning all pretense of dignity, throwing herself forward. "We are your family. You can't leave us like this. Where will we go? How will we live?" Claire paused with her hand on the brass doorknob. She didn't turn around. She looked straight ahead at the frosted glass of the boardroom door, her reflection clear and strong. "I suggest you find a quaint two-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, Mother," Claire said softly. "I hear bleach does wonders for the floors." She opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and let the heavy oak click shut behind her, sealing the Mitchell family inside their own tomb. The fall of Mitchell Pinnacle was not a quiet fading into obscurity. It was a spectacular, very public implosion. Over the next 6 weeks, the reality of the offshore default and the impending federal indictments stripped the Mitchell family of every illusion they had ever clung to. The federal authorities placed a freeze on all their domestic accounts. The luxury cars were repossessed in the middle of the night. The sprawling multi-million-dollar estate was seized as collateral, forcing Richard, Eleanor, and Vanessa to move into a cramped, furnished corporate apartment on the edge of the city. A cruel, poetic echo of the exile they had forced upon Claire. Vanessa's husband, a man who had married her for her trust fund and social standing, filed for divorce the moment her bank accounts were locked. He took their children to his parents' estate in the Hamptons and filed a restraining order, citing her impending criminal charges. Vanessa spent her days pacing the small beige apartment, weeping hysterically, her designer clothes replaced by unwashed sweatpants, her golden child status completely pulverized by the weight of federal fraud. Richard spent his days making desperate, frantic phone calls to old friends, politicians, and golfing buddies, begging for loans, for legal favors, for anything that could stop the bleeding. But power is a fair-weather friend. The moment Richard lost his leverage, his calls went straight to voicemail. He was a pariah, but a drowning man will grab onto a razor blade if he thinks it will pull him up. And in their darkest hour, a razor blade was exactly what was offered. It came in the form of a heavily redacted email from a private equity firm based out of New York. Aegis Holdings. Aegis Holdings proposed a buyout. They offered to acquire the entirety of Mitchell Pinnacle's toxic debt, satisfying the offshore syndicate in full and absorbing all corporate liabilities. In exchange, the Mitchell family would surrender 100% of their voting shares and equity. The company would be completely dissolved and absorbed into Aegis. For Richard, it was a humiliating defeat, but it was also a lifeline. If Aegis paid off the syndicate, the immediate threat of asset seizure and the civil lawsuits from the shadow banks would disappear. They would lose the company, they would lose their wealth. But Richard believed it would generate enough goodwill with the prosecutors to negotiate a plea deal that kept them out of prison. They had to sign. They had absolutely no other choice. The closing meeting was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday morning, held in the sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room of a neutral bankruptcy law firm downtown. Richard, Eleanor, and Vanessa sat on one side of a long, cheap laminate table. They looked like hollow shells of the people they had been just 4 months ago. Eleanor's hair was unstyled, the gray roots showing. Richard's suit hung off his shrunken frame, wrinkled and smelling faintly of stale scotch. Vanessa stared blankly at the wall, her eyes swollen and dead. Across from them sat a team of sharp-suited, silent lawyers representing Aegis Holdings. In the center of the table rested the final acquisition documents, hundreds of pages that would officially end the Mitchell dynasty. "Are the principals of Aegis Holdings joining us, or are we just dealing with the suits today?" Richard asked, his voice a raspy, exhausted whisper. He couldn't even muster his usual arrogance. He just wanted it to be over. The lead lawyer for Aegis, a stern woman with steel-gray hair, checked her watch. "The CEO of Aegis Holdings is arriving now, Mr. Mitchell. She wanted to finalize the signatures personally." Richard frowned. She. Before he could process the word, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. The rhythmic, confident click of expensive heels echoed against the linoleum floor. Claire Mitchell walked into the room. She wore a pristine, tailored white suit that cut a striking contrast against the dreary, gray atmosphere of the bankruptcy office. Her hair was perfectly styled, her posture immaculate. She radiated an aura of absolute, untouchable power. She did not look at her mother. She did not look at her sister. She walked directly to the head of the table, pulling out the chair opposite Richard, and sat down. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Vanessa letting out a small, trembling gasp. Richard stared at Claire, his bloodshot eyes widening in confusion, his brain completely short-circuiting. He looked from Claire to the Aegis lawyers and then back to his daughter. "Claire, what are you doing here?" Richard stammered, his voice cracking. "This is a closed legal proceeding. We are signing the company over to Aegis Holdings." Claire reached into her designer briefcase and pulled out a sleek gold pen. She set it gently on top of the acquisition documents. "I know, Richard," Claire said, her voice smooth, calm, and terrifyingly pleasant. "I am Aegis Holdings." Eleanor let out a sharp, choked sound, bringing both hands to her mouth. That's impossible," Richard whispered, his hands beginning to shake violently. "Aegis is a New York private equity firm. They have hundreds of millions in capital. You were living in a cheap apartment." "I was living quietly, Richard. There is a difference," Claire corrected, leaning back in her chair and crossing her legs. "I incorporated Aegis Holdings 2 years ago, right around the time I realized you were using my name to hide your tax evasion. I started quietly diverting my personal bonuses, smart investments, and secure capital from loyal, silent partners who knew who actually ran Mitchell Pinnacle. I built a war chest. I was waiting for this day you finally drove the company off a cliff." Claire gestured gracefully toward the towering stack of documents. "When Vanessa forged my name and took out that offshore loan, she didn't just bankrupt the company. She drove the valuation of Mitchell Pinnacle down to absolute zero," Claire explained, her eyes locking onto her father's. "So Aegis Holdings stepped in. I bought your debt from the offshore syndicate for pennies on the dollar. And now, per this contract, I am acquiring 100% of Mitchell Pinnacle's equity." Richard's face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The realization crashed down on him with the force of a freight train. "You orchestrated this," Richard gasped, clutching his chest. "You let Vanessa take the loan. You let the company bleed, so you could steal it from us." "I didn't steal anything," Claire said, her voice dropping into a hard, unforgiving register. "You threw me out in the rain, Richard. You fired me to stroke your own ego and pamper your golden child. You handed Vanessa the matches, and I simply sat back and let her burn the house down. And now I am buying the ashes, for exactly $1. Claire picked up the gold pen. She leaned forward, flipped to the final page of the contract, and signed her name with a bold, sweeping flourish. Claire Elizabeth Mitchell, sole owner and CEO. She slid the document across the table. "Sign it, Richard," Claire commanded, "or I walk away right now. The syndicate files the default, and the federal prosecutors freeze whatever pennies you have left in your retirement accounts." Richard looked at the pen. He looked at the daughter he had treated like a workhorse for a decade. He was completely, utterly defeated. His hands shaking uncontrollably, he picked up the pen and scribbled his name. Eleanor, weeping silently, signed next. Finally, Vanessa took the pen, her tears staining the paper as she signed away her fleeting, disastrous reign as CEO. Claire calmly pulled the documents back, sliding them into her briefcase. The snap of the brass locks sounded like a vault sealing shut. "Well," Claire said, standing up and smoothing her immaculate white jacket, "that concludes our business. Thank you for your cooperation." "You monster," Eleanor sobbed, looking up at Claire with eyes full of venom and despair. "You took everything from us. We have nothing. You promised the debt would be forgiven. You promised we would be free." Claire paused, looking down at her mother with an expression of profound, chilling pity. "I promised Aegis Holdings would absorb the corporate debt, Mother," Claire said softly. "And I have. The shadow banks will not come after you. You will not lose your lives over the money." Claire turned her gaze to Vanessa, who was shaking like a leaf, and then finally to Richard. "But Aegis Holdings cannot absorb criminal liability," Claire continued, the temperature in the room seemingly dropping 10 degrees. "Forging a signature for a $50 million loan is federal fraud, Vanessa, and orchestrating the evasion of $4 million in capital gains taxes is a felony, Richard." Richard's eyes went wide. But you bought the company. You control the evidence now. You can bury the files." "I could," Claire nodded slowly. "But as I told you in the boardroom 6 weeks ago, I already handed the unedited audio recordings and the tax files to the Department of Justice. I was just waiting for the ink to dry on my acquisition before they moved forward. As if on cue, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open once more. This time it wasn't lawyers who walked in. It was 4 federal agents in dark windbreakers, their badges glinting in the harsh fluorescent light. Arthur Sterling walked in behind them, his face a mask of solemn justice. Richard Mitchell, Eleanor Mitchell, and Vanessa Mitchell, the lead agent said, his voice echoing loudly in the enclosed space. You are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, tax evasion, and forgery. Panic erupted. Vanessa screamed, scrambling backward over her chair, trying to run into the corner of the room. No, no, please, I'm a mother. Claire, please stop them. Claire. Eleanor threw her arms around Richard, wailing hysterically as the agents moved in, pulling their hands behind their backs. The cold, sharp click of metal handcuffs snapping shut cut through the screams. You can't do this to your own family, Richard roared as an agent forced him against the wall to search him. I am your father. I gave you life. You ungrateful, vicious bitch. You will burn in hell for this. Claire stood perfectly still, watching as the federal agents shackled the people who had spent 32 years using her, manipulating her, and trying to destroy her. There was no joy in her heart. There was no triumphant laughter. There was only peace. The quiet, profound peace of a woman who had finally excised a tumor she had carried for her entire life. She walked toward the door, stopping just inches from where her father was pinned against the wall. You didn't give me life, Richard, Claire whispered, her voice so quiet only he could hear it over the screaming. You just gave me a job, and I quit. Claire walked out of the conference room. She didn't look back as her family was dragged out in handcuffs. She walked out of the building, stepping into the crisp, cool afternoon air. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, allowing beams of golden sunlight to wash over the city streets. A sleek black town car was waiting at the curb. The driver opened the door for her. Where to? Miss Mitchell? The driver asked respectfully. Claire settled into the plush leather seat, feeling the absolute weightlessness of true freedom. She looked out the window at the towering glass and steel skyscraper in the distance, the building that housed Mitchell Pinnacle, her building. Take me to the office, Claire said, a genuine soft smile finally gracing her lips. I have a company to run. 2 weeks later, the executive suite of the newly rebranded Aegis Pinnacle was quiet. The ostentatious velvet couches and ridiculous modern art installations from Vanessa's era were gone. The office had been restored to its former glory, sleek, functional, and radiating quiet power. Claire sat behind the massive mahogany desk. She was not hunched over spreadsheets in the middle of the night. It was 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. The company was stable. The toxic executives had been purged. The loyal employees had been promoted and given massive raises, and the stock price was already recovering under her undisputed leadership. Arthur Sterling walked into the office, holding 2 steaming cups of artisanal coffee. He set one down in front of Claire and took a seat across from her. The grand jury indicted them all this morning, Arthur said quietly, taking a sip of his coffee. No bail. The judge deemed Richard a flight risk. They are looking at minimum sentences of 7 to 10 years each. Claire looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city spread out below her, vibrant and alive. She thought about her mother's manipulative tears, her sister's cruel vanity, and her father's suffocating arrogance. They were gone, locked away in concrete boxes, stripped of the wealth and status that had defined their entire existence. Thank you, Arthur, Claire said softly, picking up her coffee cup. How does it feel? Arthur asked, watching her carefully. Being the sole owner of the empire. Claire took a sip of her coffee. The warmth spread through her chest, replacing the cold, hard armor she had worn for so long. She looked at the gleaming office, the empire she had saved, the legacy she had rightfully claimed. She was no longer the scapegoat. She was no longer the workhorse. She was the architect, and the house was finally, entirely hers. Claire leaned back in her chair, her smile reaching her eyes for the first time in years. It feels, Claire said, her voice steady and clear, like the trash has finally been taken out. She turned back to the window, watching the city below, ready to build a future that belonged to no one but herself.